In this video, we're going to talk about the last type of market structure that we're going to think about in the class, and that's monopolistic competition. So let's just talk briefly about where that fits in. We've got perfect competition here. We've got monopoly down here. We've talked about lots of models of oligopoly that kind of fit in here. I probably shouldn't even put a point right there, but let's go ahead and put it. Oligopoly. And now we're going to think about monopolistic competition, which is down here closer to perfect competition. Monopolistic competition. Monopolistic competition is just like perfect competition, except the goods are going to be differentiated. So let's go ahead and think about the characteristics. In this type of situation with monopolistic competition, there are lots of buyers and sellers. Lots of buyers and sellers. The goods are going to be differentiated, so the goods are not going to be identical like they would be with perfect competition. So the goods are differentiated. And then we've got free entry. There's free entry into the market. Now what we know, and let me say, I've said this several times, if it's been a while since you've seen monopolistic competition, I would encourage you to go watch my Principles of Micro video on monopolistic competition, where I go into a lot more depth than I'm going to go into here. Here's what we know from monopolistic competition. Because the goods are differentiated, each firm is going to face a downward sloping demand curve. So each firm is going to have some market power because of the differentiated goods. So if we think about the inverse demand curve that the firm is going to face, it's not going to be the market demand curve, because these are going to be lots of different firms in the market. They're going to face a very elastic demand curve, and it's what we would describe as a residual demand curve. This is a residual demand curve. This is the exact same type of demand curve as what we just talked about in the previous video, where we were thinking about the Bertrand competition model with differentiated goods, where there you had a residual demand curve and it was dependent upon the price that each firm chose. Same idea here. With perfect competition, each firm faces a perfectly elastic demand curve. So the demand curve faced by a perfectly competitive firm we know is horizontal. There's the demand curve they face, and the marginal revenue curve that they face lies right on top of the demand curve. That's when there are perfect substitutes. The goods are identical here. So the demand curve that they face, also a residual demand curve, is perfectly elastic. Now the goods are differentiated, so the demand curve is going to have a little downward slope to it. And what that means is, if we think about a particular price like P1, we can look at the quantity that this firm would sell at that price. There's Q1. If the firm raised its price to P2, they will lose some customers, but not all of their customers. So there are substitutes for the good, so they will lose some customers to the other firms that are selling a similar good, but they won't lose all of them. They could certainly raise their price enough to lose all of them, but they still have some market power. They face a downward sloping demand curve. What that means is, what we know from monopoly is that anytime you face a downward sloping demand curve, your marginal revenue curve has the same intercept and twice the slope. So for a monopolistically competitive firm, they're going to face a downward sloping marginal revenue curve. If we think about profit maximization in the short run for a monopolistically competitive firm, let's put the marginal cost curve that the firm faces up here. They're going to face a very elastic demand curve. The marginal revenue curve has the same intercept and twice the slope. It's also going to be pretty elastic. There's our marginal revenue curve. The firm still maximizes profit by producing the quantity where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. So right there's where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. There's the quantity, I'll call it QMC for monopolistic competition. There's the quantity they will produce, and then they will get the price that they're going to charge from the residual demand curve that they face. We go up to their residual demand curve, and there's the price, PMC. So you can see this picture is the exact same picture as what we did with monopoly. Profit maximization for a monopolistically competitive firm in the short run looks exactly like monopoly. The math of it is exactly the same. You still are going to be looking for the marginal revenue curve that the firm faces and setting it equal to marginal cost. You'll solve for quantity, plug that quantity into the residual demand curve that they face, and you'll get the price. So any problem that you did with monopoly, I could take the exact same problem and just label it monopolistic competition. We know that the demand curve with monopoly would be the market demand curve, so I would call this the residual demand curve for a monopolistically competitive firm. But the problems are the same. So that part of it should not be any different for you than what you did with monopoly. Also keep in mind that with monopolistic competition, there's going to be a markup above marginal cost. And so if we look at the quantity here and we go up to the marginal cost curve, we see that right here is the marginal cost curve. There's the marginal cost of producing that particular quantity. Right here is how much the monopolistically competitive firm marks up its price above marginal cost. So when you buy a product from a firm that's a monopolistically competitive firm, you can be assured that the price you pay is greater than their cost of production. And remember that monopolistic competition is the most common type of market out there. If we think about markets that fit these types of characteristics, where the goods are identical, and there are lots of buyers and sellers and free entry, this is the restaurant industry, clothing, furniture, books, movies, consumer electronics. This is by far the most common type of market that's out there. In the short run, the picture looks just like monopoly, only you have to remember that this is a residual demand curve rather than the market demand curve. What we want to do now is talk about monopolistic competition in the long run. So this is short run. Let's talk about long run. The thing that differentiates the short run and the long run is free entry. In the long run, other firms can enter the market. So what we know is that if profit is positive for monopolistically competitive firms, in the long run, other firms will enter. And that will continue until profit gets driven to zero. What we need to do is we need to review what that looks like for a monopolistically competitive firm. So we need to think about how entry and exit affect the residual demand curve that a firm faces. So I always illustrate this to my classes by saying, let's think about what would happen to us if we owned a pizza restaurant. And let's consider what would happen to demand for our pizza if another pizza restaurant exited the market. So if another pizza restaurant closed down for good, they exited the market, think about what would happen to demand for our pizza. And you'll probably realize quickly that demand for our pizza will increase. On the other hand, if we own a pizza restaurant and another restaurant enters the market, then demand for our pizza will decrease because some of our customers will end up liking that pizza restaurant's pizza and they'll become their customers. So if other firms enter, then our residual demand curve shifts to the left. Let's draw a picture of that. Here's our residual demand curve. We'll call it D1. If we're thinking about, and let's make sure we label this as a monopolistically competitive firm. If other firms enter the market, that will shift our residual demand curve to the left to say D2. There's the effect of entry into the market. If other firms exit the market, then that will increase demand for our product. So exit from the market will end up shifting the demand curve that we face to the right to say D3. Now in my principles class, I always ask my students to think very carefully about this. Because if you kind of just go through this quickly, students will look at that and they'll say, okay, that makes perfect sense. And they'll forget to stop and think about the fact that if you go back to what you know about the determinants of demand, the things that shift demand curves, we typically go through 5 of them. And if you go back to the beginning of this class, we talked about 5 things that shift demand curves. And those are things like income, a consumer's income shifts their demand curve, prices of related goods, their tastes and preferences, expectations about the future, and then the number of buyers in the market. The number of buyers in the market shifts the market demand curve. The number of sellers in the market does not shift the market demand curve. The number of sellers in the market shifts the market supply curve. And so here what we've got is we've got the number of sellers changing and a demand curve shifting. So we have to be really careful about what's going on here. What's happening is, of course, that this is a residual demand curve. This is not the market demand curve. If this was the market demand curve, then firms entering and exiting wouldn't have any effect on it. But it's a firm's residual demand curve. And so entry and exit does affect a firm's residual demand curve. The things that cause a residual demand curve to shift are all of the things that cause a market demand curve to shift: income, prices of related goods, tastes and preferences, expectations, number of buyers, and then the number of other firms in the market that this firm has to compete against. So you have to be very careful about that. Anytime we have a change in the residual demand curve, so let's have a residual demand curve that looks like that. Call it D1. Here's the marginal revenue curve that goes with it, MR1. Let's suppose there's entry into the market and this residual demand curve shifts to the left, something like this, to D2. When that happens, the marginal revenue curve goes with it. Now here's the marginal revenue curve, MR2, that goes with the residual demand curve, D2. So now that we understand how entry and exit affect a residual demand curve, now we're able to figure out what happens in the long run. Let's clear this off and then we'll talk about what this looks like when profit gets driven to 0. Let's start this process by drawing a picture where we've got a monopolistically competitive firm that's earning a positive profit. So, and I'm going to draw this picture relatively big because there's going to be a lot going on, and I would recommend that in your notes you draw the picture big as well. So let's put in here the marginal cost curve and also the average total cost curve, because we need that average total cost in order to see what profit looks like. Let's go ahead and do that. So here's our marginal cost. Let's put our average total cost in here. Remember, average total cost is U-shaped. It crosses that marginal cost curve right at the bottom of the average total cost. Now, as long as the residual demand curve lies above that average total cost curve, this monopolistically competitive firm will earn a positive profit. So let's start with a residual demand curve that looks something like that. We'll call it D1. Our marginal revenue curve that goes with it, because the demand curve is very elastic, the marginal revenue curve is also going to be pretty elastic. It's going to look something like that. We'll call it MR1. Now, don't worry where all of your intersections are. That's not really that important. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to look where marginal revenue crosses marginal cost. Right there is going to be the quantity that this firm is going to produce. We'll call it Q1. They're going to charge this price. We'll call it P1. And we can figure out what profit looks like the same way that we did with monopoly. All we have to do is we need to know the average total cost of producing this quantity. So we need to go from that quantity up to the average total cost curve. We hit it right there, and if we bring that over, let's call that average total cost 1. The profit that this monopoly would earn, or that this monopolistically competitive firm would earn, would be the area of this rectangle right in there, just like we did with monopoly. Now, this firm is going to be earning a positive profit. Let's start with this by calling this point A. So we're going to start at A. Profit is greater than 0 at A. So what's going to happen is, in the long run, in the short run, this firm can earn a positive profit, but in the long run, other firms will enter because they want to get in on the positive profit. As they enter, the residual demand curve that this firm faces is going to start to shift to the left. I'll switch colors here and see maybe if I can draw it in a different color so it'll be easier to distinguish where we started and where we end up going to. So let's suppose there's some entry that's taking place. Entry will continue until profit goes to 0, but I'm going to draw kind of an intermediate step where there's been some entry, but not as much entry as there's going to end up being when profit equals 0. So let's suppose there's enough entry that the residual demand curve that this firm faces shifts to the left to D2. Now, when that residual demand curve shifts to the left, the marginal revenue curve goes with it, and so let's suppose our marginal revenue curve ends up being right in here. That's kind of a very inconvenient place for it to have intersected, but we'll go with it. Now our residual demand curve is shifted to the left, but what we need to do is we still need to look where marginal revenue and marginal cost intersect. That's going to happen right down in here. So the quantity that this firm is going to produce is going to fall. Not surprisingly, demand for its product has fallen, so it's going to produce less. So there's Q2. They're going to get the price from the residual demand curve, so we go back up to this residual demand curve. We hit it right there. There's P2. We see that the quantity that they produce falls, the price that they can charge falls. Again, not surprising because demand for their product has decreased. Now we need our average total cost. If we go up from this quantity to the average total cost curve, we hit it right about the same average total cost there, maybe even just a hair lower. So average total cost, I'm going to put it right there. Exactly where it is not that important. There's average total cost 2. But what you can see is that the profit has decreased for this firm. Profit will now be the area of this smaller rectangle right down here rather than the bigger rectangle. So profit falls. Let's write everything that's happened. Quantity falls. Price falls. And profit falls. And as long as that residual demand curve continues to shift to the left, these things will continue to happen. Quantity will continue to decrease, price will continue to decrease, and profit will continue to decrease until profit goes to zero. So this continues until profit is equal to zero. What I want to do here is just finish this section by drawing a picture of what this looks like at the end of the process. So this residual demand curve D2, that's just an intermediate step. Let's think about what this is going to look like when residual demand has shifted to the left enough to drive profit to zero. So let's put up here marginal cost. Let's go ahead and put our average total cost, and I'm going to give it some nice curvature here, something like that. There's average total cost. This residual demand curve is going to shift to the left until it has shifted enough to become just tangent to that average total cost curve. In other words, the entry will continue until the residual demand curve has shifted to the point where it ends up being just tangent to that average total cost curve at one place. Now, let's go ahead and identify our price and quantity. So here's the quantity that the firm is going to produce, and here's the price that they're going to charge. Now, in order for that to be the quantity, my marginal revenue curve has to intersect my marginal cost curve right there. So my marginal revenue curve ends up looking like this. That is a picture of a monopolistically competitive firm earning a profit equal to zero. The key here is that marginal revenue and marginal cost are equal at the profit maximizing quantity. So this process will continue until this residual demand curve has shifted enough to bring profit equal to zero. What you would see if we continued this is that as price falls, average total cost is going to start to rise, and they're going to come together right at the place where that residual demand curve would end up being just tangent to that average total cost. Now, in a class, a lot of times I will ask the class to draw a picture of what a monopolistically competitive firm looks like when it's earning zero profit. That's the way you draw it. The key is to draw your marginal revenue curve last, because you need to make sure marginal revenue and marginal cost intersect at the correct quantity. Let's finish up this section actually this chapter by thinking about this question: is profit equal to zero inevitable? We've seen that profit gets driven to zero in a lot of different situations in this last half of the semester, where we're thinking about different market structures. Of course, with perfect competition, profit gets driven to zero. Profit gets driven to zero with monopolistic competition. We also saw with oligopoly there were times when profit gets driven to zero, even when there are barriers to entry. But let's think about in this particular situation, is profit equal to zero inevitable? Well, here's what happens. Profit is equal to zero because this demand curve, this residual demand curve, is just tangent to the average total cost curve. There are two things that the firm could do that can change this. So one possibility is to increase residual demand. A firm will have a very strong incentive to increase its residual demand curve. And you might ask, well, how does a firm do that? Well, this would be advertising or marketing itself. So advertising, coming up with new differences for its product. If it's a pizza restaurant, coming up with new pizzas. So that's one possibility. Another possibility is that they can become more efficient. They can reduce costs. If they're able to reduce costs, then they can shift these average total cost and marginal cost curves down. And if they're able to shift that average total cost curve down, then the residual demand curve would once again lie above the average total cost. So those are the two things that the firm can change that could possibly cause its profit to go from zero to positive again. If they can shift the residual demand curve to the right or reduce average total cost, or some combination of the two. The problem is that in the long run, entry will take place. If profit becomes positive again, entry will take place and will drive it back to zero. In my principles class, I recommend that my students take a look at the TV show Bar Rescue, because I think that it is a perfect example of exactly this type of market. The bar industry is a monopolistically competitive market. Bars are all basically doing the same thing. They're selling alcohol and food. They're doing it in slightly different ways, so the goods are differentiated. Maybe one place has a little bit different drinks, or maybe the drinks are a little better. Maybe the food's different, or the food's better, or maybe they have some idea, some theme for the bar that makes it different from other bars. But what you see there in that type of market is that profit gets driven to zero. And so what happens on that TV show is that John Taffer comes in and he does two things. Every show is based upon these two things. You rebrand the bar, you remodel it, and you come up with some new ideas for food, and you come up with some new ideas for drinks. And that is just an attempt to shift the residual demand curve for that bar to the right. And he also reduces costs. Every bar has inefficiencies, systems that don't work well, or something about the way the food is prepared creates too much waste. And so he attacks this. He reduces costs by making them more efficient or giving them more stations at the bar so that they don't have to walk as far. Attacks both of these things, and then every episode ends the same way by talking about the fact that the bar now is doing better. Their revenue has gone up. What I would always like to see is what happens if we went back in 2 years, or maybe even a year for some of these bars, because if they've come up with a new idea, other bars can copy their ideas. Other bars can reduce costs, and there's a lower bound on how much you can reduce costs. You can never reduce your costs to zero. So it's really, really tough to become efficient and stay efficient. And so I would like to see what happens once they go back after a year or two, when maybe their costs have started to creep back up, and maybe what was new a year ago isn't new anymore. And I've heard John Taffer say in different episodes that the process that you have to go through to make a bar successful is that you have to do this every few years. Maybe every 3 years you need to kind of rebrand it. And maybe some bars are successful, and that may not need to happen. Maybe they have a loyal set of customers that come back regardless of whether or not they've got a new drink or a new food item or new stuff on the walls. So there are certainly some bars and restaurants that for whatever reason they're successful, and they can enjoy profit that's positive in the long run. But for most of them, it's going to get driven to zero. And I like the TV show because if you can get past all of the yelling and some of the nonsense, it is a perfect example of monopolistic competition. The problem for most of those bars is that their profit's going to get driven to zero or even negative if they're inefficient in the long run as they face stiffer competition. So hopefully that gives you an idea of how monopolistic competition looks, and I will see you later.